Hello, New Prospect family. Welcome to RTB 2021 for May the 15th, 2021. So our texts for today are Numbers 24, Psalm 66 and 67. Then we have Isaiah 14, and then First Peter chapter 2. Now I'm going to see if I can do this. I want to see if I can bring all these texts together because I think we can providentially they actually all do kind of go together here. So let's start with Isaiah 14. Okay, so in Isaiah 14 we have some more of those judgments and statements against the nations, particularly against the king of Babylon. Here, there is still this hope for Israel that God is going to once again have compassion on Jacob and Israel in verse 1, and that He will restore them. And when He does restore them, guess what happens? Strangers will come and attach themselves to the house of Jacob. So there's this Israel at this time, 700 years before the time of Christ, is facing the strength of the Assyrians, as we read about, for instance, this judgment on Assyria at the end of chapter 14. After the Assyrians lose their power, ultimately the Babylonians will come onto the historical scene and oppress the Israelites, draw them into exile. And of course, this prophecy here says that it's going to be this taunt song starting in verse 4, where the king of Babylon thinks he's high and lifted up, but he's going to be brought low. So God is ultimately going to he's going to hold those nations that are oppressing His people to account. And when He lifts his people back up, nations are going to be drawn to them. So there's a sense that God is still working, right, and that He's going to He's planned something for His people. And when He fulfills that plan for His people, what will happen? Well, He will ultimately He will draw the nations to Himself. Hold that thought. How do we know that God's plans and purposes will be fulfilled? Look at verse 27. The Lord His host has planned it. Who can frustrate it? That's again a rhetorical question, basically saying no one can, right? God will stretch out His hand. No one's going to turn it back. He's going to perform what He is going to perform. Okay, so what is He going to perform? Well, it's going to be something at the least that's going to draw in the nations. And it's going to be something at least that's going to restore His people. Well, how will this come about? I'll turn over to Numbers 24. Here's this pagan prophet, right? Some 1,400 years before the time of Christ. And God uses this pagan prophet to say how this ultimate victory is going to happen. And it's and the ultimate drawing into the nations and the restoration of His people. How will all this happen? Look at verse 17. Here we have one of the earliest messianic texts in all of Scripture, and it's in the mouth of all things of a pagan prophet. And this is what he says: "I see him now, but not near. But I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come forth from Jacob; a scepter will rise from Israel, and he will crush through the forehead of Moab and tear down the sons of Sheth." This is viewed, by the way, even by the Jews as a messianic prophet. That's why the star kind of becomes this symbol of the Messiah, of the King in the line of David, and this is going to be God's means of doing the things that He talked about in Isaiah, right? That's why, by the way, again, Isaiah focuses so much on this messianic King, Isaiah 9 and Isaiah 11 that we've looked at already. So we kind of have a picture of what God is doing here, right? He's got purposes that's not going to be thwarted, and those purposes will involve His people being restored, nations being judged, but then brought into attached to His people. Nations will be drawn in. And how will this be done? It will be done through the Messianic King. Okay, hold those thoughts. Turn over to Psalm 67, 66 and 67, but we'll focus in on Psalm 67. God be gracious to us and bless us and cause His face to shine upon us, that your way may be known on the earth and your salvation among the nations. Let your peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. Let the nations be glad and sing for joy, for you will judge the peoples with uprightness and guide the nations on the earth. Let the peoples praise you, O God. Let all the peoples praise you. The earth has yielded its produce. God, our God, blesses us. God blesses us that the ends of the earth may fear him. Here we have this global psalm, right? The speaking of the praise that God is going to receive, not just from his people, but from the nations. And it's going to come when God blesses his people. Well, what does it mean for God to bless his people? It means to restore them to right covenant relationship. And how will that be done? It will be done through his messianic king. And when God does that, ultimately, it'll be to the praise of the glory of his grace. Much more that we could say about Psalm 67. It's one of my favorite psalms. But I may come back to that at the end of our session. But let's move on to First Peter chapter 2, where First Peter here specifically tells us all these things, right? In chapter 2, verse 9, but you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. For you were not a people. So at one point, Peter's telling his audience that at one point you were separated from God. You were not a people. You were part of those nations that were being judged, like the Babylonians, like the Assyrians, like the Moabites, like the Philistines. You're part of those people. But now you're brought in. You were not a people, and now you've received mercy. Here, quoting extensively from the Old Testament, Peter is. But this is God's restoration of his people. Well, how would it happen? How does all this happen? How do you who were not a people now are a people? Now you're the chosen race, royal priesthood, holy nation. By the way, this is quoting from Exodus 19. So they have now been attached to the people of God. They have received the promises that originally the Israelites received. That's us, by the way, that we've received those promises. We are now that chosen race, a royal priesthood, holy nation. How do we do this? Well, it's from God's restoration through his messianic king. And it's because God's purposes would not be thwarted that he has done this. Now, what does that mean for us now? Well, it means that if we're participating in the promises of Israel, it also means that we're now tools in God's hands for achieving the furthering of those plans and purposes of God, right? We are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession. If you remember back in Exodus 19, I actually preached on this. This was how God identified his people right before they go into the promised land, right? They are commissioned as God's covenant people. And as his covenant people, they have a role to play. And that role is to be a priest to the nations. What the Levites and the priests in the line of Aaron were to be to the nation itself, the nation was to be to the nations of the world. And that is to reveal God to those nations, to mediate between God and the nations, to be a conduit for God to be made known to the nations. And they were placed, by the way, and we see this in Psalm 67 as well. They were placed among the nations to do just that. They were placed at the crossroads, Israel was, so that they could be this missionary nation to the rest of the nations. And here Peter is using those same words and saying to those aliens, those foreigners, those people who are in the world but not of the world, those people dwelling in Asia Minor, you too have been purposely placed where God has placed you for the purpose of being a priest to the nations, to reveal to the nations and to proclaim, as he says here, the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. You're not where you are by accident. God has given us this role as his church and as his people to be able to play this role in the furthering of his purposes that will not be thwarted. And that's the missionary purposes of making known to the world his means of salvation through Jesus Christ. And it's through that proclamation, ultimately, that his purposes will be achieved, and that the praise of God will be gone out through all the earth, as Psalm 67 tells us. I don't know if I did that well or not, But all four of these texts, I think, go together really well to show something of what God's purposes are, his mission for himself, his mission for his people. And what strikes me about all these texts is here are texts that were written some 1400 years before the time of Christ, all the way down to 30 years after the time of Christ. And God's purposes haven't changed in that time span, and they haven't changed even now. We still have that privilege of being his kingdom of priests and holy nation, to proclaim the excellencies of him who called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. Let's do that very thing on this day, May the 15th, 2021. Hope you have a great rest of the day.